remotely from Greece, and I'll introduce them in more detail in a second, but just a quick word on this event series. So the panel today is part of the Senses of the Political event series, and it's an invitation to rethink the political by examining its genealogy, its multiple meanings, and its effects through approaching it as an affective, aesthetic, ethical, and material construct across different scales, geographies, and temporalities. So put simply, it seeks to understand how the political is being reformulated against the backdrop of seismic shifts in the structures of power and equally transformative social movements. It also seeks to draw attention to the way the political is grasped through the senses. So today we're going to focus on the sense of movement and embodiment that have become tied up with migration and mobility, which the title of today's event, Spatializing Immobility, Borders and Humanitarianism. The panelists today will each draw on their scholarship and or activism to address the question of how border, humanitarian, and security regimes have been continuously producing hierarchies of bodies, spaces, and practices. This panel seeks to situate North Africa within the broader context of the Mediterranean and the global migration humanitarian security nexus, with talks covering rescue operations in the Aegean, the Trump wall in the US, and the Greek-Turkish population exchange. And I'll introduce our speakers. Aslı Elise is Associate Professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies at New York University. Her research interests include political violence, eugenics, humanism, spatial segregation, and forced migration and cultural policy. Her first book, Humanism in Ruins, Entangled Legacies of the Greek-Turkish Population Exchange, was published in 2018. The book sought to offer a critique of liberalism from the angle of the management of difference and explored the underlying racialized logics of population transfers, partitions, segregation, apartheid, and border walls. Currently, she is working on a new project on the notion of civilizationism in the contemporary world context. Aslı spent 2021-2022 year in the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, working on this project. And joining us from Athens, Greece on the screen via Zoom is Fevos Semiounidis, who is an award-winning open source intelligence and audio-visual forensics researcher and an archivist. Holding an MA from the Center for Research Architecture, he is a researcher and investigative partner of Omnia TV and The Manifold, as well as the former director and co-founder of Desinfo Collective in Athens, Greece. He is a frequent collaborator of forensic architecture, Lighthouse Reports, among others, with his work focusing on far alt-right narrative creation and performativity online, militarized border regimes and surveillance, and human rights violations in the external borders of the European Union. And last but not least, Miriam Tickton, who is an associate professor of anthropology at CUNY, the Graduate Center. She has held positions at the New School for Social Research, University of Michigan, and Columbia University. And she has been a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton and the Russell Sage Foundation in New York City. She publishes widely on topics such as migration, borders, humanitarianism, and racial and gendered inequalities. And most recently, she has written about the idea of a decolonial feminist commons. She is author of Casualties of Care, Immigration and the Politics of Humanitarianism in France, and co-editor of In the Name of Humanity, The Government of Threat and Care. She is currently finishing a book on and against innocence. Please join me in welcoming the speakers for today's panel. And without further ado, we're going to start this discussion with Aslı. So please, thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me? So thank you so much. I am so excited to be part of this conversation with Firas and with Miriam. And thank you with you, Ola. So all the members of this panel, I'm very excited to be part of. And thank you so much for coming. At this hour on this beautiful day, actually, when the spring is calling. So I will briefly discuss a bit the underlying logics of the Greek-Turkish population exchange and address its broader implications for today's context. So the 1923 Greek-Turkish population exchange was the first internationally ratified and executed compulsory population transfer between two countries. It entailed the enforced displacement of about 1.5 million Muslims and Orthodox Christians. If you will, it was a great replacement project. It set an international precedent whereby forced migration is legitimized as a humane solution to conflicts in order to restore social order and stability promoted as peace at the time. This process has been historically referred to as unmixing and explained through nationalism and homogenization of a nation state. This is the general explanation. Usually you encounter this a lot. Over the last decades, however, scholars unraveled how the exchanges were remarkably diverse in terms of class, language and accents, religious differences, professions or regional differences as well, and what counted as a category of designation that led to their deportation did not necessarily mean those who were received harmoniously fit into their new setting. So they were hierarchized before they were deported, they were hierarchized upon their arrival. To the contrary, the arriving groups were also coded as different and subjected to differential treatments. Over the last 3 decades or so, the implications of what forced migration entailed exactly has been put into question, and whether or not fleeing for one's life also entailed forced migration. So what do we mean by that, right? Is it just an agreement that you sign? What happens when you know that you cannot survive in a city and you have to leave? While we continue to learn from these important debates, my approach to forced migration is a little different, as I consider it as part of a broader system of spatialized management of difference as a biopolitical movement. That is the control of the, so it's a story of, yes, mobility in the sense that it's a forced migration, but it's simultaneously a question of immobility. It's because you are not allowed to be freely circulating, even existing in a setting. And that immobility is the cause of your deportation in the first place, right? So basically, the story of unmixing, you can make that argument actually. The principal legacy of the exchange then is arguably its contribution to the institutionalization of the management of difference via forced migration, a form of spatial redistribution of peoples, often referred to as unmixing of peoples, as I mentioned, and this management is configured in terms of numbers and space and justified as a means of promoting security and stability. And with the 1923 exchange, it gained a legal framework in the international arena. For those seeking segregative solutions, the exchange itself not only constituted a precedent in the international arena, but it was also referred to a successful case of the so-called repatriation, especially the case of Turkey. There might be different reasons for this. There's a research that needs to be done on the subject, which we can address what success means in that case. The exchange has therefore become a reference point for others, such as the Potsdam in the after war, especially the Second World War, such as the Potsdam Agreement of 1945, the partition of India and Palestine in 47-48, and the deportation of the Arab Jews to Israel en masse, and the consideration of sending the Palestinians in their stead. These cases might differ in details, but they share the same segregative logic that sought either in theory or in practice to spatially redistribute different groups according to their backgrounds and designated origins. Informed by the principle of segregation, the exchange is thus organically related to other cases informed by the same idea: apartheids, partitions, forced migrations, and the construction of border walls, which unfortunately continue to be relevant in the contemporary world context. So the broader implications of the exchange, and given the in the post-1945 is a little bit what I want to talk about. I think it sheds light on some of the conversations that we are having. The post-1945, the decade that follows the Second World War, the management of dissidents at the time, basically one would have imagined that given the atrocities of the Second World War with the Holocaust, one would have imagined that the lessons drawn from this would have been, you know, how to engage with difference. But the lessons drawn from this was that minorities constituted a threat against peace. So what we see is then UN offering a platform for all of these systematization at a larger scale of what we had seen already with the Greek-Turkish population exchange. Then what this has done then is to have contributed to the crisis of the refugees, comparable in its scale to the refugee crisis today, right, in the post-1945 era. An overview of the 1950s international management of difference, therefore, demonstrates that basically, in order to, UN was not on its onset, was not what we seem to anachronistically attribute to it today. So for example, with its emphasis on individual human rights as opposed to collective rights, it started also like this, it started informing also the refugee regime that we see it today, because it puts the burden on the individual. Even though what the atrocities they are, you know, the differential treatment, discrimination, violence they are subjected to is because they are part of a collective, a racialized identification. Whether it is religiously defined, I'm not saying it's the same as race, but what I'm saying is that there is an assumption of bloodlines, an essence that is transmitted, assumed to be transmitted and transmittable from one generation to the next, as if agency doesn't matter. So you are what you're born into. In the Greek-Turkish population exchange, actually conversion was not an option. I'm not saying there weren't any cases off the record, but officially that was not given as an option. You were just, as long as you were Muslim, you had to leave Greece. If you were Greek Orthodox, you had to leave Turkey. Okay, so that's what I mean by racialized thinking. So in the post-war era, they were, as I mentioned, the minorities were considered increasingly as sources of instability and potential obstacles to peace, configured as a problem to be solved as if conflicts were biologically dispositioned, rather than being the logical outcome of histories of dispossession, exploitation, political violence, struggles over sovereignty, or racialized hierarchization of different groups, among other factors, like colonialism. Demographic policies developed in that era included enforced assimilation and mass transfers of minorities in Europe and beyond, under the guise of bringing social order. It clearly mattered which groups' numbers were to be regulated, not merely through birth control or mass killings, as eugenicists thought, translated into mass extermination or breeding of the desirable groups, as it were, in the Nazi Germany, for example. But what we see also in the post-war era is the fusion of the fascist eugenicist idea with qualitative demographic mindset and their translation into demographic policy. So, and what we also see is a lot of the eugenicists. So in my research in the archives, a lot of the eugenicists did not go anywhere. They moved into population studies and to refugee studies after the Second World War. One of them was Corrado Gini. Those of you who studied maybe statistics would know him. He's a very famous statistician. He was a very important figure in Mussolini's Italy. And he also was the person who generated the idea of the Gini coefficient for calculating income inequality. So he was invited in 1950 to Istanbul University to establish the Statistics Institute there. He gave lectures on the Greek-Turkish population exchange and demographics and so on and so forth with a very handsome salary. So the idea then, spatial regulations of difference may differ in details and take different forms depending on the context, but they share the general concern with unmixing, a charged term with heavy eugenicist implications, and segregation. Walls, partitions, population exchanges, apartheids, which I tend to, in my work, view as part of a larger biopolitical framework. And this also means that basically during that time, the idea was not just in the deportation, but also the differential treatment of those arriving communities in a new context. So, for example, when there were Jews from Arabic-speaking countries and Turkey that were actually going to Israel at the time, one of the demographers at the time, Jean-Jacques Berly, in France, he, for example, there was a refugee association, which I also studied as part of my work, where he was giving a talk and he was actually stating that Israel has to be very careful because these Oriental Jews will bring their diseases and they will multiply much more than European Jews, whatever that meant. And therefore, they need to be kept under control. So it's like whatever category that was chosen to generate a minimum, whatever homogeneity was, it's very clearly was not the case. People already were aware of this. I think that we sometimes think of it in anachronistic ways, but it also seems like in Europe, we have forgotten, and also in the Middle East, that all of these policies have their precedents. We had to unlearn diversity through forced policies that were erased, either assimilated or exterminated. And what we see is I'm not saying extermination in the sense of like genocides disappeared or violences disappeared, but the idea was that the groups deemed to be desirable. In order to boost their numbers, you didn't need to work on birth breeding or anything like this. You just had to import the desirable groups. And if you wanted to get rid of them, you didn't necessarily have to kill them. You could just deport them. So this mindset, we see it in the contemporary context. Their afterlives actually are still salient of all of these different policies, but we tend to look at them as parochial, tucked neatly into the past, rather than reproduced in different structural forms and manners, and informing different institutions, categorizations, and citizenship, leaving aside the humanitarian regime itself. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma. Now we can move to Kevos.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. Let's try this again. Hello, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes.
Perfect. So thank you everyone for inviting me, and especially you, Ola. It has, it's a pleasure again to see Ashley, to be here with Miriam and you. And I will not be using any sort of a presentation, even though what I will speak about is usually offered for loads of, visual, sometimes over aesthetically produced material. So I just chose not to put another extra screen between us. So my experience draws mainly as an activist from the years of 2014, 2015, and up until the effective close of the borders of European Union, setting up what is now known as Fortress Europe. I was in search and rescue. I was supporting search and rescue teams in the island of Lesbos, in the Aegean, in the Northern Aegean Sea between Greece and Turkey, and then following people, trying to support them around Athens, Thessaloniki, and the Balkan route. Speaking of where we are now, I think what is always interesting is to think of violence as continuously perpetrated, as slow violences. And it saddens me in a way, but doesn't surprise me, on the other hand, that we are here almost a decade after what was, called the refugee crisis. Nothing much has changed for the better, if anything, yet. Speaking of walls, I mean, just 2 days ago, there was an announcement that Greece will strengthen its wall with Turkey. Other states are moving towards different and newer technologies and more efficient technologies in order to use force to prevent, to intercept, to protect, to serve the interests of a European Union, of, in quotation marks, civilized world, of an unmixed place of being and an unmixed place of living. And for me, I'd like to start by thinking also in my research, but also here with you today, in terms of worthiness. So not worthiness in the way we perceive worthiness, or communities or individuals perceive worthiness, but what is the value of a body as it's perceived by the state itself? What is the worthiness of a body that crosses a border? What is the worthiness of the body that has crossed the border effectively? And what is the asylum seeker worth? And this is something that states are continuously debating, and I find that our interventions are many times helpful in this aspect of being able to consider this value, to research it, to oppose it in many ways, and to give it a different meaning, hopefully, with the communities that are affected and the individuals that are affected themselves. So when I speak of worthiness, I'm thinking of a body that has the exploitable, let's say, capacity. It's the body that is displaced, is moving across borders, is trying to move across border without the right to free movement, and even more, without the right to safe passage, even in this limited set of movements that the body is allowed. And then under this precarious circumstance, there is also the criminalization of such movement. So the smuggler that, regardless of how let's say, the Western world society would be perceived, at the same time is offering a solution. So the person that leaves is actually forced to continue these invisible ways and go between these invisible ways and the visible ways of migration to figure out what is at any given point the worthiness that this body should have. I'm also thinking of the processes of externalization, the processes of putting away responsibility from the states, putting away responsibility from state actors. And, always rings a bell when we hear the word refugee, the term refugee crisis. Was it really a refugee crisis, as it has been called, or was it a crisis of lack of social services? And now we see, almost 10 years after, basically states are saying, look, we've had enough. We don't really want to support anyone else unless they look really similar to us. I want to share here with you something that we realized recently in Greece, that the Ministry of Migration of Greece used for the first time on their website the word displaced. This was not used for anyone before the war in Ukraine and the Russian invasion. So it's actually very interesting to see who is displaced and who is deemed worthy of being received. Thus, this receptionscape, if I may call it, this place of potential of how we in societies, how we choose to receive people, how we choose to be in community with them, if it is in terms of the citizens, how it is, or solidarity actors, or how it is to deal with them and manage them and store them and exploit them, if it is on the side of the state, is very much affected by what we deem and what our societies deem worthy, and also what states deem to be able to exploit. I also want to speak a little bit about the new technologies that emerged recently, which is also part of research that many very good colleagues are doing right now. And what is frightening is the notion of a testing ground. So similar to what Asli presented and spoke about, we see right now a different set of testing grounds. Suddenly, Israeli companies that are producing surveillance technology, companies from the US, companies from the UK or France, all over the world, need these indirect battlegrounds, these indirect spaces of conflict to test non-lethal or less lethal technology, to test surveillance. And suddenly, Palestine doesn't seem to be enough. Suddenly, many places don't seem to fit this purpose. And what better field of practice for them than the borders? So we see right now how the Evros wall is not really just a wall, it's not a physical barrier, it's a digital barrier as well. We see right now that data are being used more and more, and algorithmic thinking, machine learning, artificial intelligence are all being used to further strengthen the control that societies and states mostly have over the bodies of that cross a border or attempt to cross a border. So these testing grounds, these spaces of experimentation, which are very far away from most notions of humanitarian law, of international European and national laws at many times, these very weird spaces of ambiguity are being used exactly because they offer this potential of exploitability and gain. So it's really interesting. We see in our work which countries, for example, host these new border conferences. So back in the day, we would have the military conferences. Now there is this new border immigration industrial complex, which reaches level that are deemed way more profitable in many ways. I would also like to close and think about this, like circle back into the series of terminologies and how we use them and how we see them being played out right now in Europe mostly. So we see that suddenly the words of like who's a refugee, who's an asylum seeker, who's a migrant is back in the center, in the epicenter of the discussion. So we've done a full circle. Initially we were like, we don't want anyone to be called a migrant or an immigrant. We wanted everyone to be called a person. We wanted everyone to be called a refugee. We wanted everyone to be able to be considered a displaced individual or a displaced family, a displaced community in need of help. Suddenly, we are in the process now, many people in the humanitarian sector, in the activist circles, in academia, or in legal support, suddenly we wish sometimes to actually name people asylum seekers. We seek to name people migrants. We seek to name them refugees because there is legal status attached to them, a legal status that is now here to stay, and a legal status that does not allow for any sort of mobility, social or physical mobility. And many times, again, due to these new technologies, not even digital mobility, which is something that maybe we will have the chance to discuss. Lastly, in terms of human rights violations coming from Europe and working here, I can only say, and again, we can discuss this later, that we see nothing but new technologies being used and new ways of stopping people, pushing them back, stopping them in the water or in the land borders, and effectively render them helpless and immobile when it comes to what comes next to them. Thank you. And again, thank you for the invitation. And I'm looking forward to the rest of this.
Thank you.
Now we'll move on to Miriam next. Share the screen for the slides.
Okay, yeah. Oh, yeah, thank you. And how do I advance?
There is share. And then, oh no, sorry, no, it's not this one. Just a second.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
So I just do those guys. Okay, perfect.
You're welcome.
Okay, thank you so much, Ola, for organizing this. Thank you so much to Asle and to Favos. That was fabulous. And I think I'm going to overlap quite a bit with Favos. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to start, with the migration, so-called migration crisis. So as we all know, since 2015, when migrations across the Mediterranean was declared a crisis in Europe, the language of crisis and invasion has persisted and structured conversations and political imaginations. This has led many to argue for the strict closure of borders and the deportation of migrants or people on the move, as many migrants have been calling themselves to get away from legal categories like refugee or economic migrant, which are built on hierarchy and exclusion. This will be interesting to talk about with Favos, actually, who calls himself a person on the move and who claims these other categories, which do have legal status attached to them, but always based on hierarchy. So in any case, so this has led many to argue for the closure of borders or the deportation of migrants, and to a deepening set of racisms within borders. But the crisis, so-called crisis, has also led to new struggles against borders and for a different world. So I want to argue here that in order to really understand how borders are being regulated or unregulated, we need to look not only at the international legal realm or at activism, but at infrastructural politics. So what I'm going to say here, I want to discuss two different terrains of infrastructural struggle over migration and borders. So the first is about border walls, which are built to close off resources and partition the world into haves and have-nots. And the second is an infrastructure of collective living, where people on the move are occupying abandoned spaces and working against borders and private property. We might call this a form of commoning. So I'm suggesting that it's important to attend to the infrastructural dimensions of migration and border issues, because they can produce and regularize exclusion and conceal it from the conventional fields of political discussion and legal contestation. At the same time, new infrastructures can prefigure better, more equitable worlds. My key point here is that border worlds and border walls are only one way to live in the world. And indeed, they're a very violent way. They're built and rendered real through political, material, and legal infrastructures. So we need to attend to these and to the political imaginations that are embedded in these. So if they're constructed, they can be deconstructed. Overall, my goal is to think in a small way about how to create new architectures of and for politics. I'm interested in thinking beyond the nation states, containers that either keep people in or out and that serve as the primary sites of either political belonging or exclusion, as they primarily serve to produce and maintain a world order based on inequality, violence, and death. Okay, so now first I'm going to talk about border walls. So it couldn't have been clearer under Donald Trump's presidency that the politics of migration and borders were being fought out not only in legal spaces, but by way of infrastructure. The constant key refrain of his presidency was about a border wall. Former President Trump repeatedly proposed building a big, beautiful wall, and not unlike an art installation, had contractors display several 30-foot tall prototypes in the desert, as you can see here. While borders are in part regulated by law, they are built and rendered real through political and material infrastructures. Indeed, as U.S. Customs and Border Patrol officers themselves have stated, walls are a tactical infrastructure. The goal is for them to slow people down so they can be caught after they cross. Border walls require continuous work and ingenuity to be maintained as necessary and inevitable. They have to be imagined, constructed, legalized, patrolled, and reimagined. As Anthony Dunn and Fiona Raby state, they're speculative designers, politics is a battle over the imagination, where the imagination can help us maintain pre-existing realities or create alternative visions, denaturalizing the real. In this case, the imagination both produces and is produced by infrastructure and design. Trump's political vision of a white supremacist United States was crystallized by border wall infrastructures, not just by law. Recognizing that infrastructural projects create and regulate new political formations, it's important to attend to the enactments of power in these projects. So paying attention to infrastructures in particular gives us insight into the politics of borders, and I'm going to speak for a second about the US-Mexico border. In particular, we can see how a militarized response to a fear of invasion is actually produced and amplified by the materiality of the border wall. More specifically, while border walls purport to be the materialization of national sovereignty, deriving from and protecting an essential inner national identity, paradoxically, I'm going to argue they're ultimately created by transnational political and military technologies. That is, transnational technologies and the economies they're embedded in have helped to manufacture the very idea of invasion that now drives the building of walls. So understanding infrastructural politics then allows us to see how a certain politics of fear is built by walls, not always the other way around. The challenge to this ultra-right-wing politics then has to take seriously the materiality of infrastructure and its economies. To understand how walls connect to transnational economies and political imaginaries, in order to build this idea of invasion, it's important to know a bit more about walls themselves. People often think that border walls are seamless, uniform structures, but in fact, the US-Mexico border is made up of many different designs and materials. These include levee walls, and floating fences and steel bollards and picket fences. The designs have names like Normandy, bollard, landing mat, and aesthetic. The aesthetic is an attempt to make border walls less obvious in areas such as universities or schools. It doesn't stop people from putting them right in the middle of the school, but they're supposed to look nicer. The key point is that designs, materials, and the smart border wall technologies are transnational. They're shared, as border security technology is a global industry, as we just heard from Feos. In fact, I think I attended one of the border security expos he was talking about. I went to one in San Antonio, Texas, which drew tech companies and government officials from around the world in the name of fighting transnational organized crime and terrorism. Israeli companies led the way, profiting from the fact that Gaza is a great laboratory, sharing wares such as smart fences, which are highly fortified steel barriers that have the ability to sense a person's touch or movement. Indeed, the Israeli company Elbit Systems furnishes an arsenal of homeland security systems from Gaza and the West Bank to southern Arizona. Such companies have created what some have dubbed the laboratory of the Palestine-Mexico border, where technologies are tried out and data is shared. And this was from the expo. You can see it's like it says, detect, track, classify. I mean, it's very obvious what it's trying to do. People are turned into objects to be eliminated. These are transnational technologies circulating in the name of national closure. But what does it mean that these wall technologies were developed in different political or historical contexts and for divergent political purposes? So I want to argue that designs embed their own political imaginaries. The social sciences scientists have long argued artifacts always have a politics. In the case of the US-Mexico border, these technologies import a particular political history of militarized violence. More specifically, they come from Israel-Palestine, where the separation barrier, or what many now call the apartheid wall, was initiated by Israel in 2002 at the height of the Second Intifada. The immediate setting was a renewed Palestinian uprising in the face of the failure of the Oslo Accords and the promised peace agreement that would have granted Palestinians a separate state. The larger context, of course, is occupation and the violence of settler colonialism. Israel responded with military might, doubling down on territorial security. Consequently, the barrier was developed in a highly militarized environment. It's made up of electronic fence, iron, barbed wire, and a lot of concrete. It's imposing and mostly impassable. It also uses the highest level of military technologies, from long-range sensors to drones. So what does it mean that these militarized technologies have since been imported into the United States to shore up its southern border, which was not at that time a war zone in the same sense? To be sure, the American war on drugs has indeed produced its own deep and enduring forms of conflict and violence, but of a different sort, as has the United States' own imperial and settler colonial histories. Those living around the border have coexisted for a very long time as friends and not as enemies. I mean, they're often as family. The view of invasion has been instituted in a top-down fashion. It doesn't come from the region itself, where the majority don't want a wall. So in order to sell their technology, Israelis use the fact that their war zone doubles as a laboratory game, as Fabo said. They boast that the technology was tested on the front lines. And since 9/11, the United States has reconfigured its southern border in accordance with the Israeli model. Indeed, the border wall between the US and Mexico has literally been manufactured by Israeli companies. Some have suggested that this relationship with Israel has helped to produce a militarized logic in the US, a different system which has, in effect, according to journalist Todd Miller, globalized Palestine. This has included giving contracts to Israeli companies for drones and other surveillance technologies. In addition, the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, has trained US Customs and Border Protection and Homeland Security agents, as well as US law enforcement officers, explicitly in counterterrorism, border perimeter security techniques and combat and so on. So these technologies have helped to extend the idea of a war against immigrants as invaders, legitimizing both the creation of a state of exception at the border and the use of military violence against immigrants and other people of color throughout the country. Again, to be clear, the militarization of the American landscape has a history of its own. The US-Mexico border wall also reveals its own imperial histories by being built in part by old Vietnam War era landing mats, right? These were repurposed. Ultimately, the border security complex initiated by the relationship with Israel has been grafted onto US imperial histories, resulting in a US-Israeli hybrid. In many ways, this walled security complex serves as a prototype of a border wall for the global north, a transnational political and infrastructural formation that works to keep out the racialized poor, that is, the invaders. This type of infrastructure is a form of regulation that works outside the law, but often prefigures it. Okay, so I'm going to move to the last bit, which is about no borders infrastructures. So open border legal regimes exist in a limited sense. We can think of the EU, but they're always subsumed by larger borders. So you might have open borders between, France and Germany, but that's always in a very close, as we know, fortress Europe. So there is no legal no borders regime, actually. But such visions of the world are being enacted by way of infrastructure. They're prefiguring new political formations. So once again, attending to infrastructure is critical to understanding the direction of political imagination and change. In 2009, Bridget Anderson, Nandita Sharma, and Cynthia Wright wrote presciently about no borders movements as incarnating a struggle for the global commons. And since then, much of the literature on these movements describes a politics of the mobile commons, which refers to the shared knowledge, affective cooperation, and mutual support amongst people on the move when they are on the road or when they arrive somewhere. This mobile commons, which is also a set of infrastructures, is made up of the secret knowledges and survival tricks that help people cross borders, but perhaps more importantly, also help build a larger politics of freedom of movement. It's also been spoken of as an underground railroad drawing on the history of struggle against slavery in the American South. These no borders infrastructures include the best travel routes, places to rest, safe or cheap transport, and medical or other aid en route. But in addition to infrastructures that help people move to cross borders, there's a second set of infrastructures that are helping to build no borders worlds. Occupations are a key aspect of this embryonic infrastructural politics. Occupations of buildings and land in ways not condoned by forms of liberal capitalist governance. People are not just fighting for the freedom to move, but also the freedom to live in place. So in this sense, it's about immobility as well, but in a different sense, a claim to being and becoming wherever people choose to do this. So I see occupations as a different form of commoning, which includes the struggle against enclosures and the privatization of space and property. Oft-cited goal of commons is the sharing of wealth and resources on the basis of collective decision-making. To be sure, there are many examples of commoning beyond migrant occupations, including mutual aid projects, collective gardens, kitchens, squats, and so on. We can talk about that in the discussion. But people on the move are reimagining both space and how to be together, building alternative forms of governance against the state and against what they see as unjust treatment, including the lack of basic shelter and care. They do this by occupying liminal spaces, thus challenging regimes of private property. These include border zones, hotels, abandoned buildings, monuments, churches, and this is happening all over Europe and North America. Whoever needs a home and for however long can occupy any welcoming, unlived in, or abandoned space. In these spaces, there are no good or bad migrants, categories which legal regimes often impose. In many ways, the occupations are forcing a more equitable distribution of resources. To be clear, I'm aware of how troubling the term occupation is, particularly in relation to settler colonialism. So the question here is whether such acts can be repurposed towards freedom, that is, if no borders movements can practice decolonial politics, working with indigenous communities against the nation state to undo rather than further the settler colonial project. The point is not to imagine or claim the land as empty or available, but precisely to refuse the authority of the state, challenging its rights, its right to decide who resides where. So occupations have taken different forms. While each is grounded in local histories and political context, they share a transnational imagination and set of strategies where the goal is to build collective infrastructures in which people can live together outside the rules of sovereignty and capital. So for instance, in the summer of 2018, I went to the occupied Plaza Hotel in Athens, which Febos will say more about, one of about 12 occupied buildings, which under the new right-wing government have all been shut down. Share this, that's it. So Plaza started as an example of an autonomous organization of people on the move without an NGO working top-down to manage them or provide services, although this later changed and the NGO logic took over, unfortunately. These occupations originated in the dissident history of the district of Exarchia, where abandoned buildings have been the site of collective living in action since the 1970s. So refugees and locals worked and occupied the hotel together. Rather than being contained on the margins of the Greek polity, as with so many refugee camps, people on the move lived in Athens, indistinguishable from the many who require shelter, particularly since Greece's debt crisis. So they're all houseless, out of place, and as such, they reclaim space together, creating a form of commoning. Plaza residents worked to enable children to go to school regardless of how long they would be living in Athens, decoupling social services from nation states. Indeed, as one of the Plaza residents explained to me, the local teachers organized and went on strike to enable this. So this was an experiment in how social services could be accessible to people beyond citizenship status or the state, beyond identity, driven instead by participation, presence, and mutuality. So in addition to offering access to education, they created other material infrastructures such as communal kitchens and living spaces. So there's a lot more. There are a number of other examples, and I'm just going to point to one in France, where people on the move have recently occupied abandoned buildings. Many are being co-organized with the political collective La Chapelle Debout, which initially started out as Les Gilets Noirs, which was a spin-off of Les Gilets Jaunes. So it's a long-standing, morphing political movement. But it brings together undocumented folks and others fighting against racism and imperialism. So in the spring of 2022, after assessing the many abandoned buildings in Paris, even more were abandoned because of COVID, they occupied one in the city's 9th arrondissement, and whoever needed a home moved in. They called it l'ambassade des immigrés, so the immigrant embassy. Together with locals from the neighborhood, La Chapelle Debout transformed the space into one for collective living and learning, including calling on everyone with expertise to build a collective kitchen. They stocked the building with beds and began creating social infrastructures, access to French and English language lessons, legal aid, medical care, and accompaniment to court. Unfortunately, they were expelled quite violently in October 2022, but their mission continues and they continue to occupy different locales. Immediately after, for instance, they occupied the Paris's Hôtel de Ville or City Hall, marking their presence, and they've continued to find other buildings. So these alternative forms of togetherness are about coexisting in ways that ensure everyone's survival. They proliferate horizontally in partially commensurable spaces. They're scaling out and across, not scaling up. In other words, this different political imaginary does not propose or protect a territory of belonging, but a constant state of becoming and commitment to exploring and embracing the liveliness of the world. In this sense, immobility can be reclaimed in relation to mobility and reworked. So I think I'll just stop there.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Miriam. Thank you, Asla. Thank you, Fevos, for this great arc of conversation, starting historically with the population exchange and going on to the crisis, so-called crisis, to finally ending with what I want to believe is a positive note, thinking about political imaginaries beyond the state, beyond borders, with actual concrete examples from Athens to Paris and so on. And I just wanted to bring up this point about infrastructures because I think it's very relevant to the way that now borders and exclusion has become so material. And I wanted to throw a question out there about what you think, all of you, inviting all of us to think about what would infrastructures of liberation and emancipation look like? What would they be beyond these quote unquote occupations and the way they've been repurposed for to kind of escape or counter the authority of the state? And one thing that comes to mind are, like, in terms of an actual kind of infrastructure that I can think of, are tunnels. Tunnels was the first thing that came to mind while you were speaking, Miriam. And I remember that specifically in relation to Gaza, the tunnel that connects Egypt to Gaza. That is one example that I have in mind, but also I remember when I was visiting Sarajevo, under the siege, a lot of the residents and people I spoke with talked about the tunnels that they used to use to kind of escape the gaze of the state and the war, obviously the warring factions that was happening at that time. So just like a question on infrastructure of liberation, how can we imagine speculatively thinking about design, thinking about the history of how borders have been created through population management? Is a form, the management of difference is a technology, illegal, and the management of space is a form of border making and remaking, as Asla points out. But also in the case of Fevos in the sea, right? Like how is nature also conscripted in that process of making and unmaking borders that is deployed by the state, but also by activists out there as well. So that's one question. I wanted to also touch upon this notion of inclusion and exclusion that all of you brought up in your talks about the dynamic of inclusion and exclusion that is central to the liberal project of the management of difference and border making and unmaking. Borders are oftentimes wrongly conceived as a site of deterrence and prevention. Well, they could be, they are, but also there are times when borders are a productive site, and I think Fevos mentioned that the generativity of borders as a site for the production of gradations of mobility and assigning varying values to different bodies and groups on the move. So if you can talk a little bit about that dynamic of inclusion and exclusion that's at the heart of the liberal project, because we have on the one hand also what you talked about as the management of difference, the kind of like the unmixing, the segregation on the one hand, but we also have this other strand of, you know, multiculturalism and the celebration of difference, right? So these kind of coexist together. So if you can talk a little bit more, and in the case of Greece, I'm also thinking of like the two strands of refugees are welcome, but at the same time, the pushback against refugees, they're going to take over our social services, and they're going to impoverish us and so on. So thinking about that dynamic of inclusion and exclusion at the heart of the liberal project. Thank you. So yeah, so maybe do you want to do you want to start?
So thank you. I mean, it's thought provoking, and I'll start with something that happened past summer in Greece, which was quite interesting in many ways. The long story short of a case that many, like it actually was on the spotlight of Greek news and I guess Turkey's news as well, and European news in a way, was a team of people that was stranded, a team of refugees that was stranded in an islet in the Evros River, directly in between Greece and Turkey, in an island, and I'm sharing this because it's important, that was made out of sediment, an island that officially did not exist when the borders were drawn between Greece and Turkey, through the Lausanne Convention and other different maps that were made. So what was really interesting, and again, we don't really know up until this day the specifics of the case and whether there was a casualty or not from the group. But at the same time, when the question was raised of a potential casualty, it was the first time that we saw Greece and Turkey conceding state land so easily and saying that this is not our land, this is the opposite state's land, in order for the opposite state to intervene. And, living in Greece and being here and researching in the European Union, I think that's the first time I see a state being so willing to offer even an inch of soil just to avoid responsibility. Going further, the nature, I mean, the weaponization, as you mentioned, is something that we see on a daily basis. We see that when it comes to the currents at the sea, we see it when it comes to the forests, we see it, even the weaponization of certain parts of cities, and the way that the periphery of certain spaces is less or more friendly. And just like I would like to close this small intervention with the thought of legitimizing a space. I think that apart from opening up new spaces, I think apart from like creating and co-creating and thinking about these spaces of possibility that we can create, namely, as Miriam spoke, like squats, occupations, co-living spaces, the commons, I think we should also be very wary, activists and researchers and whichever place each one has, to not legitimize spaces that the communities that are in these spaces do not wish to be legitimized. I can think only of every new camp in Greece that comes around, every new camp in other places where a priori sometimes, and this is a question for us to think about, the presence of international organizations many times ends up legitimizing the space. A space that becomes a field of visit by authorities, by mainstream media, even in certain cases by political representatives, is being legitimized as a space that is appropriate. And sometimes this comes in direct opposition to how the people detained, in the metaphorical or physical sense of the word, I dare say, in this space, or stranded, if for a more appropriate term, might feel about this space.
Thank you.
Thank you for those excellent questions. Maybe to start with the second question first about the liberal project of exclusion inclusion. I think it's a great question. I actually think we're moving into kind of deeper into the continuum of the liberal illiberal space. So I actually think this idea of saying it's about deterrence and prevention is increasingly giving way to saying, no, we just don't want you. You're lesser than, racism is explicit. You are a lesser person, a lesser being. We don't want you here. And I think illiberal logics are taking control. And so, look at Biden's closed the border. I mean, he says he's liberal. Yeah, right. Give me a break. So I think I think the liberal project is, I think it's changing, and I think those languages are humanitarianism. Who cares? I mean, I critique humanitarianism, but humanitarianism is becoming irrelevant in this too because it's part of the liberal project. So I mean, not to say that there aren't some who are saved and some who are abandoned, but increasingly, I think that logic is giving way to everybody being, anyone who wants to cross to being. I mean, again, of racialized bodies from certain places, right? Closing those borders. In very particular lines, racialized lines. So in terms of the infrastructures of liberation, emancipation. I love the way you put that, and I totally agree. The tunnels are big, definitely a big one that have been going on for ages, right? So I don't know. I mean, again, I think about the mobile commons. I think about all these different kinds of the stuff that Davos is doing with forensic architecture and alarm phone, and all of these are also architectures of liberation and emancipation. But I think that to think about the ways in which those structures of emancipation and liberation can be proliferated. They don't have to be directly connected, but they can take on similar logics. So I feel like any form that challenges private property, that challenges kind of the fact of haves and have-nots, because the biggest predictor of where a border wall is being built is the difference in wealth between the one who built the border and the one that is trying to be kept out. So it's about wealth. It's about property in racialized capitalist ways, right? So any kind of project that can challenge that will help to proliferate these kinds of commoning and other strategies. So mutual aid stuff, again, any kind of squatting or taking over, challenging private property, which allows anybody to be anywhere in some sense, I think has to be part of the strategy, whether explicitly connected to people on the move or not. I think they're all proliferating in a way that have multiple strategies joined. That's why I think it's good to think about the Underground Railroad in relation to, and I think of abolitionism, of course, as part of abolitionism, and I think of the getting rid of prisons, right? Getting rid of carceral facilities, because prisons and detention centers are connected in deep ways. But abolitionism, therefore, has to be a project and a structure of liberation at the same time that is supported by those who want open or no borders as well. So I'll stop talking.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you. I'm also not used to having my own microphone. It's just usually passive. Okay, so thank you so much for actually Fivos and Miriam for your talks and for your insightful questions, Ola. This is excellent. Oh boy. So I have a few comments in relation to this. The first question is thinking about infrastructures, right? When you were asking this question in relation to border walls, I was actually thinking about landmines, which marks Turkey's, like some of Turkey's borders. Now, there is a wall being built also on the Syrian border, but there are landmines on the Iraqi border, where Turkey is, of course, traditionally had this war with the PKK, right? So I was actually thinking about that's actually a wall that kills, right? But that is an invisible one. So just something to think with, because when you were mentioning infrastructure, I was remembering a conversation with a labor historian I had, John Scott. She told me I thought infrastructure was labor force, and I said because we are still using the language of development, which is what made infrastructure very prominent category, and I think it's very important, of course. But the reason why I'm mentioning this is because I'm now going to tie this to human capital, the infrastructure. After the Second World War, in those refugee association, that the European Association for the Study of Refugee Problem, which hosted Turkish scholars, Corrado Gini, whom I mentioned earlier. The idea was that the best refugee, so it didn't, your body categorization did not end with the racialized thinking. You had to be a labor-ready body, able to contribute to the economy. So and that was, they were engaging this as a deadweight to the society. People who were orphans, that's how they were using, right? Children, sickly, elderly, asocials, which means prostitutes. And these categories meant that nobody wanted them, and they were considered bagage social. They were like the social burden, basically, right? So people who could not contribute to the economy. And I think that mindset is being reproduced, rather than asking the question, why is it that in certain, like some of the richest countries in the world, we are not asking the question, what kind of economic policies were put into place in a way that resources are now limited. The starting point becomes the resources are limited, therefore we need to segregate. We need to get rid of the undesirables, but only this time there's a surplus of human capital, right? I think that's how also things have changed. So that's one aspect. And I think emancipation from this, I think perhaps to ask questions that put the pressure points, maybe to start from there, that's, that sounds like a joke next to the activist projects, but I still find it important. And the last thing that I wanted to mention is, I think the liberal humanist project after the Second World War put an emphasis on we are all humans, but it came with its own limits and limitations. And those limits and limitations generated a facade that was at the same time built on what we are discussing, the segregative state model. So I think that inclusion and exclusion is embedded in the nation state project. And perhaps to rethink what that entails might be one way to think about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And now we'll open the floor for questions from the audience. So, and in terms of mics, how is that going to work? Are we going to use this one or? Okay. From the back. Perfect. Thank you.
So hello, I'm taking a class called Middle Eastern Cities, and we discussed the French colonization of Algeria, specifically the city of Algiers, and how they created boulevards and streets that really disrupted the social fabric of the Kasbah specifically. And so my question for any of you up front is, how should Native peoples deal with colonized space, especially when it has a history of being racialized and of being segregated by colonizers?
I know more about colonial history.
Thanks. It's a great question and an incredibly difficult one. I don't think there's one answer, obviously, to how to deal with colonized space. We're all living in it, right? Particularly these kinds of settler colonial spaces. Algeria, obviously, yeah, too. I mean, there's lots of ways of, I think people have thought of repurposing it, right? I mean, the question is, what do you do with the kind of master's tools? How can you remake a space entirely? And a lot of, somebody like Eyal Weitzman has written really well about this, about kind of how do you live in these kinds of spaces, and can you repurpose them? But certain, as we know, material infrastructures are pretty, are enduring in many ways. And so, and they do constrain and they do shape mobility and how people are together, forms of sociality in very, very particular ways. So how to be otherwise in a space that was initially shaped by that is very difficult, I think. So undoing it in various ways, I think has to be the goal, right? I think we can't change our ways of being together when they start on the basis of segregation and partition and so on. And there are lots of projects of living in the ruins and so on and so on. But so there are ways people can cope, but I think we have to be aware of the limits all the time, constraining what we do and how we are in the world.
Just to add to that, Leopold Lambert, when he talks about the urban canyons, he's talking about actually the building of like how highways, bridges, in Turkey dam, for example, they actually generate a way of separating people. So like roads are part of this. So I just wanted to add that additional note in his remarkable funambulist. If you're interested, Miriam has an article there, if not more, unless I missed.
Favors?
I mean, I don't really have an answer. I have more of a comment and just something that comes to mind. I think it's also interesting to see what is colonial space, especially, being in Greece, which is still an open debate. as a society, we're still debating very much like whether we were colonized or whether we colonized in any way. So it's like a very, vivid space of discussion in terms of how people perceive public space and what is actually a remnant, what is a ruin, and what is an active space, and is thus usable. At the same time, I think what I always find interesting to realize in Athens and in other places in Greece is how different are the realities of the people that don't perceive their space as the one they were born into. So I will not go in the case of Athens in the sense of colonized versus never previously colonized space, but more like the space that people were born into and the space that they chose, or it was given to them, or they had to claim it, regardless. So the different realities are not only seen, like, when we speak of refugee and migrant communities in Athens, are not only seen through legal status, access to services, but all these are actually tied into the space. So it is amazing to see that even within less than 20 years of different groups of displaced communities coming and staying in Athens, you have multiple realities in the space. And I think this is why I find it very difficult to say how we could approach this space, because these are spaces that for the most part are different spaces than the ones, and I can speak only about myself here, are the ones I'm moving in, are the ones I am spending my time usually. And I think this is something, again, that we have to approach with respect. It's a common space that we have access to. Is not necessarily a space that we are invited to at all times and in under any circumstances, regardless of our identity as an activist, as a solidarity person, as a researcher, at many times. So that's why, again, it's not an answer, but it's more like a thought.
Thank you so much for this incredible panel. It's just so rich and so important. And one thing that I wanted to ask about, and it's not the most well thought out question, so bear with me, but one thing that sort of percolated up in the commentary and the presentations was this mentioning in passing, or even at some points only hinting at this category of the indigenous. And, of course, this idea that, and this, this who is born into what land, and, this idea that you have a natural relationship to your land, right? And that, of course, mobility and immobility can be seen as violent, but also uplifting, right? The indigenous, you can claim indigeneity in a certain way that, of course, is an immobility that is rights-bearing, and being bordered and landed, and autochthonous to the land. That's just sort of like timeless and immemorial politics that can be seen as very conservative, but in other ways very liberatory or liberating, right? So I hope that you can see where I'm starting to see these connections that were maybe just mentioned in passing by all three of you. And all of you could maybe speak to.
Would you like to start? Our guests.
Yeah, we'll let Favos, please start.
Thank you for this. Again, like, based on my own positionality as someone that was born and raised in Athens, but at the same time, my family doesn't trace into the borders of Greece for more than 2 generations. Actually, they were on the other side of the Aegean. So it is actually interesting to see how this, again, in the very fragmented Greek context, being indigenous has multiple meanings in very weird ways. And I'm saying this in weird ways because it is, for example, the birthing notion of the current alt-right and far-right movements, if we can call them that, the connection that they have, or that we have as Greeks, to Socrates and Plato. And at the same time, it's this the same one that brings these feelings of these negative feelings against the displaced communities and the people on the move. On the other hand, just 2 generations ago or 3 generations ago, the memory of displacement from Turkey, from the Black Sea, from other places is very vivid still, is very is very present. So I think that one of the burdens that the Greek society, at least again, is the one I'm more familiar with, has, is that it lacks this clear idea of what it means to be indigenous, even if it would be a faulty idea in the end, like a constructed identity. But it lacks such an identity. It's not clear, it's not easy to define who is Greek and who is not. It's not easy to define, you know, from the range of a color of a skin to a religion, or to a life of, you know, traditions and things that we, you know, to food. So I think this is where it is a space of potential that we use in terms of laughing about it and entertaining ourselves, because I think this is important, right? Like to be able to understand the common histories that we share, you know, between the communities, but at the same time, being a bit wary how we use it in terms of not to overprove a point sometimes.
I think it's an excellent question. It's a really, really difficult question. And I certainly, in the North American context, that's where a lot of the politics are around mobility and immobility and politics of migration. There's tensions between indigenous communities and people on the move. And so what can I say about that? I feel like there's been various movements that are trying to, as I kind of mentioned briefly, are trying to work together to respect indigenous communities without kind of taking the land yet another time in terms of immigrants. But I think there's also a discussion that questions sovereignty, full stop, you know, and the notions of sovereignty that link back to people like Locke or Hobbes that say they're about properties, but you work the land, therefore it becomes yours, it becomes private property, and I can decide who comes and no one else. So I think that is fundamentally harmful. And I actually think when you're talking to different people, that of course there are going to be indigenous groups who are going to have claims to sovereignty because of the forms of dispossession. So that is a kind of a completely normal set of claims. But I think there's further discussion about this, thinking of sovereignty as relationship and as relationality, being in good relation to the land and coming into being in relation to this, which doesn't mean private property. It doesn't mean ownership of the land. It doesn't mean you can come in and you can't, right? That I own it versus you. I think in those kinds of reworkings of the ideas of sovereignty and hence borders and all of that, people can figure out ways to coexist respectfully, right? And with mutual respect, but it's going to take a lot of political work.
Thank you so much. I think that on the one hand, I feel torn. On the one hand, I think it's a very important category to think with because, you know, because of what is happening, what has happened for centuries with colonial enterprises, but not even just that, extending to all the way to today, but also before. The way I see it is because actually indigeneity can be also a form of homogenizing the past sometimes. How far we want to go in the past. Now, for instance, you know, you can take a DNA test and you can look at multiple backgrounds, like Phivos. I'm also from the other side of the Aegean. My grandmother's side, both of them, one from Crete, the other one from Kos. But one of the things that is interesting is the Greco-Turkish War was an irredentist war, basically. So I think that while talking about this, it is also very important to think about indigeneity, maybe in terms of like colonial relationships and different kinds of like rights, and to think about it in emancipatory terms, is different from saying, basically, these are the indigenous groups, and therefore we need to go and invade that territory. Because then it leads to exactly what Phivos you were talking about, the reconquista, the reconquest of the new alt-right movements. It's like we taking certain terms, emptying them of it's called metapolitics, it also has a name. And what it does, it empties the terms from their actual meaning, like colonialism, like indigeneity. Now, for instance, and the great replacement theory we were talking about. The whole idea is now we need to reproduce, and in the United States as well, a white ethno-state, very similar to the Great Turkish Population Exchange. And the same thing happens in Europe. We are the indigenous populations. We are the white people. But how far are you going to go in the past? These were all at war with one another.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is just what I wanted to end with. Thank you.
Yeah. Such a general question. Are migrants talking about climate change? Are people talking about climate change? Because that's so huge with people moving from one place to another now. Yeah.
To be honest, for the past 7 or 8 years, I've never heard a single person talking about it. It's actually a very good question, and it's actually I'm troubled right now while I reply to you, because we know it's coming. They know. Well, I say we, as in the countries that will receive people, and till we send ourselves also to other places, right? Like, I don't think that in any way Greece is a country that will not be affected by global warming, for example. But on the other hand, no, there's no discussion about that. And I think this is also this is for two reasons. If you want my opinion in this, the first one would be that mostly we intervene, and mostly we come in community with people when there is other types of needs that are more to the point right now in terms of practically. And also because the people that we're usually getting in touch with here, at least in this context in Europe, is people that are living from something that is more conflictual in terms of armed conflict, for now, at least.
Yeah, I think it comes up in ways that are maybe less direct. So, it might be armed conflict, but armed conflict over resources and so on. So, and I was thinking in particular, there's a wonderful book by Natasha Iskander, who called Does Skill Make Us Human? And she talks about Qatar, actually, and the migrants going there to work in the construction industry. And it's a Qatari strategy to take migrants from places that have had climate change disasters. So they recruit specifically because of climate change. So for instance, Kerala in India, they've had various things. So these are populations that are educated and so on. The Qataris will actually recruit from places that are hit by climate change in order to build their kind of whatever their different kinds of stadia or whatever else it is, that in turn produces more climate change. It's incredibly cynical, evil politics. So it totally comes up. It's making them migrant. It's making labor kind of solicitation and exploitation go round. I mean, the climate change is feeding that. But whether people talk about it as such, I mean, people leave because they need jobs, right? Because their areas are destroyed. I also was going to say in different places, like so the Pacific, for instance, Fiji and all those folks are definitely talking about leaving because of climate change. Okay.
I think that in the case of Turkey, after the earthquakes, there were big floods that happened. In part, those floods are happening increasingly, in part because of faulty, problematic constructions, which cost many lives, but the construction business, but also at the same time, I think that the climate, it does change, and there are increasing instances of floodings that are happening. And this is in a region where Syrian refugees were also resettled. And the destruction is quite remarkable. So whether we talk about it at times, like in addition to the points that were already made, I just want to mention that, like, whether we think of it or not, the places where of settlement have been destroyed because of the disasters, so-called human-made disasters that actually have exacerbated their situations. So now they're like dispersed to different places, and they're not given, for example, even there is separation. They're not given enough tents if they are Syrian, but for Turkish people, they do get it.
Yes. Thank you.
We have
We have a question.
a question. Yeah, we have maybe one more. We can get one more question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Chat.
Musa say,
In the chat.
In general, I also work with idea of assemblage of humana, nature, and technology, but it seems they don't always work the same way. Infrastructure didn't seem to matter much in the way European has dealt with the Ukrainian refugees. So when does infrastructure becomes important and when it doesn't?
We need that.
Miss, yeah, Ines, can you repeat it again, please? From the question, like the last question.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Not great, but
Can you hear me now?
yes.
Oh, yeah, that's better.
A question from Sharif and Musa. In general, I also work with the idea of assemblage with humana, nature, and technology, but it seems they don't always work with the same way. Infrastructure didn't seem to matter much in the way European has dealt with the Ukrainian refugees. So when does infrastructure becomes important and when it does not?
That's a good question.
So let me make sure. Thank you. Thank you. Let me make sure I understood that. So the idea was that there's the idea of assemblages, and that brings together people, things, nature, whatever, right? And that helps to make those are forms of infrastructures. Is that what the question was
There was
saying?
a lot of typos, so I tried my best.
Oh, okay. Well, the part that I heard was also that
When infrastructure work, like when is it, under
yeah.
what conditions does infrastructure become salient
right,
in that like process?
Yeah, because
Right.
in Ukraine, it wasn't.
it wasn't salient.
Right, in
Yeah.
Ukraine, it wasn't, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it is salient. It's an infrastructure of white supremacy. That's entirely salient of why kind of Ukrainians were helped and given aid and refuge, whereas all the other folks of color were not. So to me, it is an infrastructure. It's an infrastructure, again, of certain kind of racialized beliefs about whiteness. I think they come into play, and whichever infrastructures we want to draw on, we can. I don't think people say there's no. I mean, they can say there's no infrastructure of social services. That's true, but so I agree that it is about who we want and don't, which goes back to Asla's point about this, which is like racial ethnic eugenics: who's worth it and who's not, right? Where do we partition and unmix and so on. So yeah, I think it's exactly the problematic that you raised about who's in and who's out. And that drives it more than questions of social services and so on. That's an excuse. It's, yeah.
Thank you. Asla or Davis, would you like to add anything to the question of infrastructure as we conclude?
Very briefly, in terms of again, an example from the recent reception of Ukrainian refugees in Greece. I was actually interesting that they were moved into a refugee accommodation center or a detention site, like transit detention site, which was obviously open for them while it wasn't before that open for the people of Middle Eastern origin. So I think that purely when it comes to how different structures are being utilized, I think it's you know, as much as we have possibilities to use different spaces in different ways, and so do the displaced communities, I think it's entirely, and so do states. I think the space itself bears its past and bears like a certain set of and infrastructures in extent, as Miriam said. But apart from that, they can be utilized and repurposed. So I think it's entirely up to the people that use them and assigned again values and meanings to them.
Right. And also, if I may add to that, it seems that infrastructure, and even though Miriam, your point was highlighting the materiality, and like really that's what's crucial to infrastructure, but we can also think about infrastructures of like ideological infrastructures and legal infrastructures, and thinking about that expansively as these networks and people as infrastructure, right? Social networks and so on. So I think we can think, even though materiality is very central, and I have to admit, I never thought about, it never occurred to me to think about what walls are made of until you showed your slides. And I'm like, I think this is something we need to be thinking about, right? Because we just passed in these concrete structures, right? So the materiality is very important, but we can also expand our understanding of infrastructure to think about it in terms of social, ideological, and legal as well, to kind of drawing on that last point that was made. I think thank you so much for this conversation and for all your wonderful, provocative and hope-inducing insights that I think will stay with many of us, at least myself and I'm sure others in the audience, for weeks and years to come. I think this is going to be always a relevant question, especially climate change as well. So thank you once again, Fevos, Simonides, Osla, and Miriam, and thank you for the audience. Thank you for your questions, and thanks to our student workers who helped us put this event together, helping us with technology and logistics, Ines, Tony, and Dylan. Thank you, and Jared, who's part of the Kevorkian Center. He's outside. But I would like to thank everyone, Fidel Harfouch, and Andrea Brown, Assistant Director of the Center, who helped put this together. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Okay. Thank you.